I remember that Tuesday morning like it was etched in slow motion. The sun had just started to creep over the rooftops, painting the living room walls with pale gold streaks. The coffee machine gurgled beside me, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed beans. I had risen early, as always, not for myself but for him, my son, even though he was technically a young adult now, 19, and perfectly capable of getting up on his own. I had grown used to mornings like this, quiet, ordered, a rhythm that made the house feel alive but manageable. That morning, the text came. A short buzz on my phone, barely noticeable at first. I picked it up casually, thinking it was one of his friends or a group chat notification. But then I saw it, and my chest tightened, a pulse of heat rushing up my neck. I want the $2,200 Samsung. You'll upgrade me. The words were simple, clipped, entitled, and yet they hit with the force of a hammer. I stared at the screen for several seconds, letting it sink in. I had seen texts like this before from younger children, from teenagers testing boundaries, from friends and acquaintances. But this was my son, my own flesh and blood. I had raised him, guided him, sacrificed for him in ways that went unnoticed. And here he was, casually demanding a device worth more than a month of my discretionary spending. More than a luxury. It was almost a bribe, a test, a claim on the love and attention I had already given him. I remembered the early years, the tiny hands that had clutched mine as we crossed the street. I remembered the scraped knees and whispered pleas at midnight for comfort. I remembered staying up late to help him finish school projects, sewing costumes for plays, writing letters to teachers advocating for him. I had done all of this because I loved him, because I believed that love was about guidance, patience, and presence. Never once had I thought love could be equated with a gadget. I typed my reply slowly, carefully, as if the act of responding could somehow set the tone for the lessons I wanted him to learn. No. Simple, firm, absolute. Not rude, not emotional, not apologetic. Just no. The reply sent. I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because I had asserted a boundary. Apprehension because I knew the storm was coming. I was not wrong. Within minutes, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was in all caps. You owe me that. The word screamed entitlement, assumption, and a misunderstanding of reality that made my teeth ache. I read it, reread it, and felt the familiar pang of disbelief. He thought that because I loved him, because I had provided for him, the world owed him obedience. The morning continued, but the energy in the house had shifted. Even the coffee tasted bitter, like a warning. I watched him move through the rooms, barely noticing me, as if our history and his upbringing had been irrelevant. He had breakfast, scrolling through social media, checking his friends' posts, comparing devices and games and lifestyles, and I saw the roots of his demand. Envy, social pressure, and entitlement, all wrapped up in a neat little package of expectation. I tried to remind myself to breathe, to not let emotion cloud judgment. I thought about the times I had given in too easily, smoothing over tantrums with immediate purchases, thinking it would buy peace, buy gratitude, buy love. But I had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that yielding to entitlement only strengthens it. It rewards a pattern of manipulation, turning affection into a currency that can be spent recklessly. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the world outside. Cars hummed down the street, birds darted across power lines, the neighbor's dog barked at nothing. Everything seemed normal, everything moving in predictable rhythm, except for my son's demands. And I realized then, with a clarity that was both harsh and liberating, that I could no longer act out of fear of his disappointment or anger. I had to act out of principle, out of the long game of teaching responsibility. He sent another message, and this one was more calculated, more deliberate, though no less entitled. He tried the guilt angle, reminding me of sacrifices I had made, of nights I had stayed up when he was sick, of the things I had done that supposedly obligated me to buy him this phone. I read it and felt a surge of old memories, both tender and frustrated, flooding through me. It was the perfect storm of manipulation and adolescent confidence. I knew that responding impulsively would have been a mistake. Patience was the only weapon I had. I remembered my own upbringing, the lessons my mother had tried to teach me, the times I had tested boundaries and learned consequences the hard way. Parenting was a ledger, and this was a line in the account, a test of balance, fairness, and moral fortitude. So I did nothing, at least outwardly. I allowed the texts to buzz silently, my unread messages stacking like small warnings of the confrontation to come. I went about my morning routines, tidying the kitchen, checking emails, answering work messages. Each ordinary action felt like a rehearsal for the storm I knew would hit. I reminded myself that teaching a lesson is often quieter than expected. It requires observation, timing, and the patience to let natural consequences unfold. The day stretched on. He continued to send small messages, escalating from polite reminders to sharp demands. I imagined him pacing, phone in hand, waiting for compliance that would not come. I imagined the tension in his chest, the frustration building like a storm cloud overhead. And I realized something crucial. This was not about the phone. It was about power, control, and understanding that the world does not revolve around his desires. I reflected on past conflicts, the tiny skirmishes that had revealed his entitlement over the years, the times he had demanded video games midweek, the instances when he had insisted on buying snacks with money I had allocated for other purposes, the moments he had used anger to manipulate me into agreement. Each was a small rehearsal for this confrontation, each a clue to the pattern I had to break. By afternoon, I had made my decision. I would not buy the phone. I would not yield to threats or shouts or guilt. But I also knew that words alone would not be enough. He had learned too well that noise and insistence can bend wills. He needed consequences that were tangible, that required him to engage with responsibility rather than assumption. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I began to formulate the plan. I thought about his tuition account, the one I had maintained since he began college, the account I had carefully overseen to ensure his education continued uninterrupted. That account was under my control. It was legal, it was moral, and it was the perfect leverage to teach him a lesson he would not forget. I considered the ramifications. Would he be angry? Of course. Would he scream? Almost certainly. Would he learn? That was the hope. I understood that the action was bold, almost draconian, but sometimes parenting requires boldness, particularly when patterns of entitlement threaten to solidify into adulthood. Night fell, and I called the university. My heart thumped as I spoke to the clerk, explaining the need for a temporary hold on the tuition account. I did not request a cancellation, only a pause, a freeze that could be lifted once he demonstrated accountability. The clerk processed it efficiently, unaware that this small act was part of a larger lesson, a controlled experiment in teaching responsibility. By the time I returned to the living room, the house was quiet, the shadows stretching long across the walls. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth calm the tension in my chest. I checked my phone once more, imagining the message he would send upon discovering the freeze. I felt a pang of guilt but tempered it with the understanding that this was necessary. He needed to learn that entitlement carries consequences. I lay in bed that night, awake despite exhaustion, thinking about the coming confrontation. I imagined the scene. Him standing at my door, furious, demanding explanations, shouting as if volume could alter reality. I imagined the struggle to maintain calm, to speak with authority and clarity while he processed frustration and disappointment. And I realized that this night, this small pivot in his life, could shape the way he viewed responsibility for years to come. The phone buzzed once more before I fell asleep, an innocuous notification that would not yet reveal the consequences. I smiled softly, knowing the storm was coming and that for the first time in a long time, I was prepared to meet it not with fear or anger, but with strategy, patience, and the quiet authority of a parent who would not be manipulated by noise or entitlement. The morning would bring confrontation, tension, and lessons. But for now, the quiet held its own power. And in that silence, I knew that a simple text had set in motion a test of character that would echo far beyond the cost of a phone. Morning arrived with ordinary light, but the atmosphere in the house felt charged. I could sense it even before the first text appeared. He sat on the edge of the sofa, phone in hand, scrolling with intent, as if scanning for the world's approval. His casual entitlement hung in the air, heavy and familiar, a ghost of arguments past. I poured myself coffee and tried to stay calm. I knew today would be difficult. Yesterday's simple no had not landed as a boundary, but as an obstacle. He needed to be challenged, and that challenge would not be comfortable for either of us. The phone buzzed. I read the first line, my heart sinking and my mind sharpening. You're being unfair. It's just a phone. Every other parent would have said yes. He was angry, but the anger was carefully constructed, measured, meant to provoke guilt. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining his tone. I had heard it before. The tone that suggested he was right by default, that my experience, sacrifice, and reasoning didn't matter. I typed slowly, carefully, refusing to mirror the frustration. I explained again that a phone is a privilege, not a right. I reminded him of the sacrifices that tuition, meals, and shelter required. I tried to keep the tone neutral, calm, unemotional. But as soon as I sent the message, I felt the tension build further. He replied almost instantly. You owe me that. He was yelling at me through text. Capital letters, exclamation marks, clipped sentences meant to mimic shouting. And he thought he could bend reality through volume alone. I sipped my coffee, grounding myself, imagining a scale where entitlement weighed heavily on one side and responsibility on the other. It was tipping dangerously. I tried reasoning. I wrote a longer message, explaining that respect and responsibility must come before privileges. I reminded him of the rules of our household, of prior lessons, of the cost of tuition, of everything I had provided over the years. I hoped words could slow him down, that reflection might set in. He did not pause. Instead, he escalated. He texted, then called. He paced through the rooms, phone pressed to his ear, voice rising, repeating the same points with subtle variation. You promised, he said. You said yes before. You owe me that. I heard the frustration in his voice, the echo of every small manipulation I had endured over the years. I let him speak, quietly for a moment. I allowed him to vent. Parenting had taught me that listening is a weapon sometimes more powerful than shouting. He would believe he had the floor, but I had the stage. I thought about the past. Every birthday he had tried to negotiate, every small gift that had been leveraged into a demand, every tantrum I had smoothed over to maintain peace. I recalled the exhaustion, the patience, the lessons I had attempted to impart. And I realized that this was the culmination of all those moments, a test of principle, of strategy, of moral strength. I responded with calm firmness. No, I said again. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I only stated facts and expectations. And I waited. The silence that followed was loud, a tension-filled pause that made my teeth ache. He escalated further. He began to use emotional manipulation, reminding me of nights I had stayed up when he was sick, of sacrifices made that allegedly entitled him to compliance. He painted a picture of injustice, of love repaid with denial, and it was almost convincing in its emotional architecture. Almost. I reminded myself that emotional manipulation is part of growing up in a world of entitlement. Some children learn negotiation through tantrums, and some never learn to wait. I would not reward coercion with submission. I had to think several moves ahead, like a player in a game where patience is the winning strategy. Hours passed. His messages flooded in, alternating between guilt, anger, sarcasm, and pleading. Each one was designed to test my resolve. Each one a probe into the limits of my patience. I read them carefully, parsing tone, timing, and intent. I analyzed what would break him and what would break me. I refused to budge. By midday, the argument had shifted into a new dimension. He texted friends, trying to garner support, posting in group chats about my refusal. He framed me as the unreasonable parent, the villain in a narrative where he was the heroic son wronged by circumstance. I could hear the echoes of his frustration in my mind. Imagine his friends whispering, debating, offering advice that fed his sense of entitlement. I knew then that words alone would not suffice. He needed a consequence that was tangible, that required effort and reflection. A lesson in accountability he could not ignore. The tuition account came to mind. It was my leverage, my tool to shift understanding from demand to responsibility. I considered it carefully, weighing legal, moral, and emotional implications. It was not punishment, it was structured consequence. I also thought about escalation. If I acted too harshly, I could break trust. If I acted too softly, he would never learn. The balance was delicate. I reviewed our family history, past confrontations, and the outcomes. Every misstep had taught me something about timing, patience, and strategic action. This moment required all of it. Even as I planned, he continued. His texts grew more desperate, more performative. He accused, argued, pleaded, and threatened. I allowed it to happen, like a storm passing over the landscape. I did not intervene directly. I watched, analyzed, and waited for the right moment to act. By evening, I had composed a message that summarized my stance clearly and firmly. I reminded him that privileges must be earned. I warned that further coercion would be met with structured consequence. I did not mention the tuition account yet. I left the message open-ended, a quiet tension that would carry through the night. I prepared dinner in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint murmur of the television, the occasional car passing outside. Every small sound reminded me that life goes on even in conflict, that lessons are absorbed slowly, and that patience is a weapon few learn to wield. He sat at the table, phone in hand, scrolling intermittently, clearly frustrated by my silence. He tried conversation, seeking validation, reassurance, or a softening. I responded with brief, factual answers, maintaining calm and composure. My tone was neutral, almost boring, but it carried authority. I knew that authority would matter far more than words of anger or pleading. Night approached. The sky darkened, the house quieted, and I felt the weight of the decision I was about to make. I knew that once the tuition account was frozen, there would be immediate and intense consequences. He would be furious, perhaps feel betrayed, perhaps lash out. But I also knew it would teach a lesson he could not ignore. I reviewed the plan one last time. The freeze would be temporary, reversible, but undeniable. It would force him to engage with responsibility, not entitlement. It would not harm his education or future, only slow the path of unearned privilege. It would teach him that accountability is non-negotiable. And then I called the university. My heart pounded as I navigated the automated system, entered account numbers, and spoke to the clerk. I requested a temporary hold, explaining it as a structured parental action to ensure compliance with financial responsibility. The clerk processed the freeze efficiently, unaware that a life lesson had just been set in motion. I returned to the living room, the house cloaked in shadows, sipping tea and listening to the ticking clock. Each tick sounded like a countdown, a pause before the storm. I imagined him discovering the freeze, his disbelief, his outrage, his negotiation attempts. I imagined every reaction, anticipating, analyzing, preparing. Finally, I went to bed, exhausted but resolute. Sleep came fitfully, thoughts bouncing between concern and satisfaction. I reminded myself that parenting is often about discomfort, about setting boundaries that are initially unpopular, but ultimately transformative. Morning would bring confrontation, tension, and lessons. He would stand at my door, voice raised, demanding explanation. And I would meet him not with anger, but with calm authority, strategy, and the quiet power of consequence. The day had passed with a weight that I could feel pressing on my shoulders. The argument had escalated in subtle and overt ways, the texts piling up like storm clouds in my mind. Each one was designed to provoke, to challenge my authority, to make me bend to his demands. I had not. I had maintained calm, patience, and strategy. But the next step required deliberate action. One that would resonate beyond words. One that could no longer be ignored. I sat in my living room, dimly lit by the soft glow of the table lamp, coffee long cold beside me, phone in hand. I reread the barrage of messages he had sent throughout the day. The fury, the pleading, the audacity, it all blended into a storm of entitlement that needed containment. I sipped tea slowly, grounding myself, letting my pulse settle, preparing for the next move. The tuition account had been in my control for years. I had set it up meticulously, ensuring bills were paid, deadlines met, and his education remained uninterrupted. It was a tool of responsibility, a framework for trust, and now, it would become the instrument of accountability. I knew the risks. I knew that freezing it could spark anger, resentment, and confrontation. But I also knew it was a calculated risk, a lesson delivered through action rather than words. I opened the university portal, double-checked account numbers, login credentials, and authorization permissions. Every step felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move could disrupt his studies, trigger administrative headaches, or escalate conflict beyond repair. But I was careful, methodical, deliberate. The clerk on the other end of the line was polite, professional, and unaware of the life lesson being enacted. I explained the request for a temporary hold, framing it as a standard parental precaution. I did not reveal the tension, the entitlement, or the lessons I hoped would unfold. The clerk processed it efficiently, and the confirmation email landed in my inbox, a small, quiet triumph that carried enormous weight. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, feeling a mixture of satisfaction, anticipation, and apprehension. I knew what the morning would bring. Confrontation, shock, yelling, perhaps tears. But I also knew that confrontation was necessary for growth. Children, and even young adults, often learn more from discomfort than indulgence. Night deepened, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I moved through the rooms, checking locks, tidying spaces, maintaining order. Each step was deliberate, a way to anchor myself in calm and control. I imagined him discovering the freeze, pacing, demanding, negotiating, frustrated that his assumptions no longer applied. Sleep came fitfully. I lay in bed, eyes open, mind racing through every possible scenario. Would he scream? Would he accuse me of betrayal? Would he understand the lesson or only perceive cruelty? I allowed myself a small smile, tempered by the awareness that the night would test both of us. I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From scraped knees to late-night tutoring, from birthday negotiations to countless small manipulations, he had learned over the years that persistence could bend reality. But this was different. This was not about persistence. This was about responsibility, about consequences, about learning that privileges are earned and respect is mutual. I recalled mornings when I had patiently guided him through homework, evenings spent sewing costumes for school plays, afternoons driving him to countless appointments, weekends spent juggling work and parenting simultaneously. Every act had been a lesson in patience and dedication, yet he had absorbed the wrong lesson. That love equates to compliance. That pattern had to end. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. Each tick echoed like a countdown to revelation. I visualized the scene. Him standing at the door, fury in his posture, phone in hand, texts unread or misread, expecting obedience rather than accountability. I felt no fear, only resolve. The lesson was mine to deliver, and I intended to deliver it with clarity and calm. I checked my phone one last time before attempting sleep. The screen was dark, a temporary silence before the storm. I imagined his first reaction, the surge of disbelief, the quick pivot from entitlement to frustration. I pictured his pacing, his phone clenched in hand, his words sharp and loud. And I imagined myself steadfast, unmoved by theatrics, prepared to enforce the boundary I had set. As the night deepened, I thought about my own upbringing. The lessons I had learned from my mother were strict, often uncomfortable, sometimes harsh. They had shaped me into someone who could hold firm, who understood that growth requires discomfort, and who could see consequences not as punishment but as guides. That wisdom was now mine to apply. Around midnight, I awoke briefly, a restlessness in my chest. I checked the confirmation email again, ensuring the freeze had been applied correctly, that the instructions were clear, that no loopholes existed. Everything was in place. The stage was set, the consequences ready, the lesson imminent. I reflected on parenting as a ledger of choices, where each action, each decision carries weight. The freeze was not punitive, it was corrective. It was structured, limited, and necessary. It was a test of character, a framework for accountability, a mirror held up to entitlement. I imagined him lying in bed, unaware, confident, believing the world owed him. I imagined the shock that would ripple through him when he discovered the truth. I felt a small thrill, not of cruelty, but of the inevitability of learning. Sometimes the harshest lessons are the ones most worth absorbing. I rose briefly to check on the house. The living room was dim, shadows stretched across furniture, the gentle hum of electronics blending with distant traffic. I moved with purpose, a quiet sentinel, ensuring everything was in order for the morning confrontation. The tension in the air was palpable, almost cinematic, like the calm before a storm in a suspenseful film. Returning to bed, I allowed my mind to wander through past conflicts and victories, preparing for the challenge ahead. I thought of the lessons of patience, strategy, and moral clarity. I reminded myself that true parenting often requires discomfort, sometimes for both parent and child. The freeze was a tool, a means to an end, a carefully applied measure of accountability. Hours passed. Sleep came in fragmented waves, each one accompanied by imagined scenarios. Him discovering the freeze, pacing the hallway, shouting, demanding explanations, pleading for reversal. I visualized my calm responses, the boundaries I would maintain, the clarity I would offer. I rehearsed the dialogue internally, preparing to meet fury with reason, entitlement with consequence. At dawn, the house remained quiet, the anticipation heavy. I lay still, listening to the soft noises of the waking world. The stage was set. Every element, from the confirmed freeze to the careful planning, was aligned. The next chapter was about to unfold, and I felt ready. The night had been long, full of reflection, strategy, and preparation. I had balanced the weight of responsibility, the lessons of the past, and the anticipation of confrontation. By morning, he would discover the tangible result of his actions, the boundary he had crossed, and the accountability he had so far ignored. And as the first light touched the walls, I felt a quiet confidence. The freeze was more than a technical measure. It was a message, a lesson, a test of character. I had set the stage, applied the consequence, and prepared to guide him through the discomfort he had created. The confrontation was inevitable. The lesson was ready. And I was calm, prepared, and resolute. The sun had barely risen when the first sound hit me. A sharp, insistent pounding at the front door. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of anticipation and resolve settling over me. I knew the sound, the tone, the energy behind it. It was him. My son, furious, untempered, demanding. The morning light streamed through the window, highlighting the small cracks in the wood of the door, illuminating the scene that was about to unfold like a drama I had rehearsed silently for hours. I rose slowly, deliberately, moving toward the door with calm purpose. I could hear his voice through the wood before I opened it, high-pitched, raw, demanding. He shouted my name, each syllable a mixture of anger, disbelief, and frustration. My pulse quickened slightly, not from fear, but from the knowledge that the lesson I had set in motion was about to meet reality. I opened the door just enough to face him, the morning sun catching the tension in his posture, the wild energy in his hair, the fury in his eyes. He stood there, phone clutched tightly in one hand, fists tense at his sides. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and I could see the shaking of his jaw, the quick intake of breath, the frantic energy of someone who had expected compliance and instead found consequence. He began immediately, shouting, arguing, accusing, pleading all at once. He could not yet comprehend the freeze on his tuition account. He called me unfair, cruel, overreacting, betraying him. He rattled off every grievance from the previous day, every small manipulation, every perceived slight. His words were fast, relentless, a river of emotion seeking to overwhelm me. I let him speak for a few moments, listening calmly, breathing steadily, allowing the torrent to flow past me without matching it. I had learned over the years that anger is often most powerful when allowed to exhaust itself. He would learn nothing from yelling if I engaged in the same manner. Calm was my ally. Authority my tool. I responded softly, deliberately, stating only facts, not emotion. I explained that I had frozen his tuition account temporarily. I did not shout. I did not threaten. I only articulated the reality. Privileges are earned, responsibility is required, and entitlement cannot dictate action. I spoke slowly, choosing words that were firm yet measured, words that demanded attention without escalating conflict. He stared at me for a moment, disbelief etched across his face. The fury had not diminished, but confusion was now intertwined. He had not expected my calm. He had expected argument, capitulation, perhaps even panic. He did not understand that control had shifted from emotional reaction to strategic consequence. Then the questions began, rapid fire, sharp and incredulous. Why? How could you do this? You promised. You can't. I answered each carefully, repeating the same principles, emphasizing responsibility, respect, and accountability. Each response was a brick in the foundation of the lesson I was building, solid, deliberate, and unwavering. He shifted tactics, moving from outrage to negotiation. He promised, pleaded, bargained, trying to find a loophole or a concession. I allowed him to speak, analyzing each offer, each word, each inflection. Some were performative, others genuine. I filtered them, assessing which reflected understanding, and which were attempts to manipulate. The tension in the house was palpable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper, every hum of distant traffic seemed amplified. Time stretched, each second a slow beat in the rhythm of confrontation. I remained calm, breathing steadily, projecting authority without aggression. I remembered the small victories of his childhood, the lessons of patience, effort, and accountability I had imparted over the years. I drew strength from those memories, from the knowledge that this confrontation was an extension of a lifetime of teaching. Each act of calm resistance, each measured response, was building the framework for a deeper lesson than any phone could provide. He became increasingly frustrated, alternating between accusation and argument, his voice rising, then cracking, then falling to pleading. I did not respond emotionally. I let silence carry weight, allowing him to feel the discomfort of consequence. Silence, in this context, was a teacher more powerful than any lecture. I explained that the freeze was temporary, structured, and necessary. It was not punishment, but a lesson in accountability. He could restore the account by demonstrating responsibility, following instructions, and engaging in honest dialogue about obligations. My words were clear, deliberate, and unyielding. He paused, breathing heavily, eyes darting as if searching for a hidden motive or a trick. He tried to interpret my calm as weakness. I remained firm. The calm authority I projected was not fragile, it was deliberate. He had expected chaos, confrontation, emotional reaction. Instead, he found a boundary, a structure, a principle enforced with quiet certainty. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. He paced, muttering under his breath, phone in hand, grappling with the reality of his actions and their consequences. I watched, silent, observing the shift in his energy. The fury began to ebb slightly, replaced with dawning realization that shouting would not alter the outcome. I offered guidance. I explained that responsibility is not learned through anger, entitlement, or coercion, but through deliberate action, effort, and adherence to rules. I described steps he could take to regain access, emphasizing that he must engage actively and demonstrate understanding rather than demand compliance. He resisted, of course. Resistance is part of growth. It is the friction that polishes understanding. He argued, negotiated, and attempted to manipulate. Each attempt was met with calm, measured response, reiterating boundaries and expectations. Slowly, frustration shifted to contemplation, and the first spark of understanding began to emerge. I reminded him that consequences are not permanent, that mistakes are opportunities for learning, and that respect for rules is foundational for independence. His eyes, initially blazing with fury, now flickered with uncertainty. The tension in the room shifted from confrontation to contemplation. At some point he stopped pacing and slumped into a chair, phone abandoned for the moment. The energy in his posture changed, a subtle but significant shift. He was no longer solely focused on outrage. He was beginning to process, to internalize, to consider the lesson. I continued to speak calmly, reinforcing principles of accountability, responsibility, and earned privileges. I shared memories, gentle reminders of past lessons, small victories, and the rationale behind the freeze. Each word was chosen carefully, designed to guide, not to coerce, to teach, not to punish. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting light into corners of the house previously shadowed by tension. He began to engage, asking questions about how to restore the account, how to plan for responsibilities, how to demonstrate maturity. The confrontation, once a torrent of fury, had shifted into dialogue. I allowed him to make mistakes in his proposals, to stumble in articulation, to negotiate imperfectly. Each misstep was a chance for reflection and growth. I corrected gently, guided patiently, reinforced consistently. The lesson was becoming tangible, practical, internalized. By mid-morning, the first signs of real comprehension emerged. He articulated a plan, clumsy at first, then increasingly coherent. He considered work schedules, budgeting, and scholarship applications. He began to understand that responsibility requires effort, planning, and adherence to boundaries. I observed quietly, stepping in only to clarify, reinforce, or redirect. The balance between guidance and autonomy is delicate, and I navigated it with care. The confrontation had become a teaching moment, a structured environment where he could experiment, learn, and internalize principles of accountability. As the day progressed, moments of frustration remained, but they were tempered by emerging understanding. He began to recognize the connection between action and consequence, entitlement and limitation, demand and negotiation. By evening, the energy in the house had shifted. The confrontation that began with shouting and fury had transformed into dialogue, planning, and tentative comprehension. He still resisted at times, but the foundation for responsibility had been laid. I reflected on the confrontation, aware of its intensity, significance, and transformative potential. Parenting is rarely linear, rarely easy. Growth is forged in discomfort, reinforced through structured consequence, and solidified through reflection and guidance. The day ended with tentative calm. He retreated to his room to draft proposals, plan budgets, and consider work options. I remained in the living room, reflecting on the lessons imparted, the boundaries enforced, and the quiet authority maintained. This confrontation was only the beginning. Accountability, responsibility, and earned privilege are cultivated over time. But the foundation had been established, firm and deliberate. He had met consequence and begun to engage with it thoughtfully. The confrontation had achieved its purpose: to teach, to guide, and to illuminate the path from entitlement to responsibility. The journey would continue, but the first chapter of growth had begun. The confrontation was over, but the lesson was only beginning. Over the following days, I watched him navigate the consequences of his actions, and it was both exasperating and quietly satisfying. The tuition freeze had been temporary, but the ripples it created extended far beyond the account itself. He began to approach responsibilities differently, tentatively at first, almost like a tightrope walker testing the stability of the wire. He created schedules, tracked assignments, and started managing small personal finances. He even began budgeting for minor purchases, realizing that entitlement alone would no longer bring him immediate satisfaction. It was slow, sometimes frustrating progress, but the foundation was there. I observed, occasionally intervening to guide, never to rescue. Each small mistake he made was a lesson, a reflection of his own choices, and I allowed him to experience the natural consequences. I realized that independence cannot be taught through repeated indulgence. It requires friction, reflection, and practice. He had moments of frustration, of course. He sent texts and called, still testing limits, questioning decisions, and negotiating boundaries. But the tone had shifted. The fury of the confrontation had given way to tentative dialogue, tentative engagement, and cautious responsibility. I could see glimpses of understanding flicker in his eyes, fleeting at first, then more consistent as weeks passed. One afternoon, I found him quietly sitting at the dining table, notebook spread before him, a pencil in hand, meticulously planning his budget for the month. I watched silently from the kitchen, feeling a strange mix of pride and relief. The boy who had demanded a $2,200 phone without thought was slowly becoming a young adult capable of foresight, planning, and accountability. I reflected on the lessons of parenting, realizing that the most important moments often come wrapped in discomfort. Growth is rarely linear. It is forged in conflict, reinforced by consequence, and solidified through reflection. The tuition freeze had been the catalyst, the tangible manifestation of responsibility, but the real work was internal. Over the weeks, small victories accumulated. He paid bills on time, asked questions thoughtfully, and even apologized for moments of entitlement. Each step, though minor, represented a shift in mindset, a recognition that privileges are earned, not demanded. I celebrated quietly, understanding that reinforcement and patience are more powerful than immediate rewards. I also reflected on my own journey as a parent. I had been tested repeatedly, challenged by manipulation, and confronted with the difficult balance between authority and compassion. The experience reinforced my belief that parenting is less about controlling outcomes and more about guiding character. Lessons take time, persistence, and measured intervention. There were setbacks, naturally. Some days he would regress, forgetting the principles he had learned, slipping into entitlement or impatience. But each setback became an opportunity to reinforce the lesson, to engage in dialogue, and to guide him back to responsibility. Growth, I realized, is iterative and requires patience. I documented these observations in my own mind, reflecting on patterns, triggers, and responses. I recognized that communication is not just about speaking but about observing, listening, and timing interventions. The freeze had been a strategic pause, a moment of structured consequence, but the ongoing guidance required nuance, empathy, and consistency. I noticed changes beyond the practical. He began showing greater respect in our interactions, listening before responding, considering consequences before acting. He approached friends and peers differently, negotiating rather than demanding. The entitlement that had once dominated his personality was being tempered by understanding, foresight, and reflection. Social dynamics at school also shifted. Teachers reported improved engagement, responsibility in assignments, and proactive communication. He began to take ownership of projects, not because I enforced it, but because he had begun to internalize the principle of accountability. The ripple effects of a single intervention, carefully timed and executed, were extending into broader aspects of his life. I reflected on the ethical dimension of my actions. Some might have viewed the freeze as harsh, punitive, or manipulative, but in context it was structured, limited, and fully within my authority as a parent. It was a deliberate measure to teach a principle essential for adulthood: that life does not bend to entitlement, that responsibility is non-negotiable, and that actions have consequences. I began to notice subtle shifts in our relationship. The tension that had defined interactions was replaced by cautious trust. He began confiding small worries, asking for guidance on budgeting, time management, and academic planning. The openness was tentative but meaningful, a sign that respect and understanding were beginning to replace frustration and entitlement. Weeks turned into months. The freeze remained a memory, a pivotal moment rather than a permanent punishment. It had done its work. He had learned that boundaries are meaningful, that privileges must be earned, and that accountability is essential for independence. The lessons were internalized, not imposed. I reflected on my own evolution. I had learned to trust my judgment, to act with clarity and calm authority, to balance firmness with empathy. Parenting, I realized, is as much about guiding character as it is about meeting immediate needs. The process requires courage, strategy, and faith in the long-term outcome. One evening, I found him sitting quietly at his desk, writing in a journal. He looked up and smiled, a small, genuine smile, and said, "Mom, I get it now." I understood that statement not just as compliance, but as acknowledgement of learning. It was a moment of connection, reflection, and growth. I felt a wave of pride, tempered by humility. I had guided, intervened, and allowed consequence to do its work, but he had ultimately internalized the lesson on his own. That is the true measure of success in parenting: Not immediate obedience, but long-term character development. As the months passed, the patterns solidified. He continued to engage with responsibility, approach challenges thoughtfully, and navigate social interactions with greater maturity. The entitlement that once defined him was tempered by experience, reflection, and consequence. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. I reflected on the broader implications. Life is full of moments that test character, patience, and judgment. Teaching accountability early creates resilience, independence, and the ability to navigate complexity with integrity. The tuition freeze had been a catalyst, but the ongoing guidance, reflection, and reinforcement had been the essential components of growth. Our relationship deepened. Conversations became richer, less transactional, more meaningful. Mutual respect replaced tension. The lessons of accountability, responsibility, and earned privilege became embedded not as rules, but as principles guiding behavior, thought, and interaction. I understood, finally, that the hardest lessons are often the most enduring. They require discomfort, confrontation, reflection, and guided resolution. But when absorbed, they shape character, resilience, and the capacity to navigate life with integrity. Looking back, I saw the journey clearly, from entitled demands, through confrontation, to structured consequence, and finally to growth and reflection. The path had not been easy, but it had been transformative. The boy who once demanded a $2,200 phone had become a young adult capable of understanding, planning, and internalizing responsibility. I smiled quietly, reflecting on the lessons, the confrontation, and the growth. Parenting is never easy, but it is profound, challenging, and deeply rewarding when patience, strategy, and love converge to guide a child toward understanding and maturity. The story did not end with a single lesson, a single confrontation, or a single freeze. It continued through months of guidance, reflection, and practice. But the pivotal moment, the night the tuition account was frozen, remained a touchstone, a turning point, a lesson in accountability that would resonate for years to come. And in that quiet, reflective morning, I understood the true power of consequence, the importance of boundaries, and the lasting impact of guided responsibility.